What the fuck is up? It is day 83 of reading every single day for the rest of my life for 30 minutes every single day. We are at the top of page 14, Carrying the Fire by Michael Collins. Let's go. Oh shit, I didn't even start the timer. 1 second. Completely forgot about the timer. I didn't care, I just wanted to start reading, see? Muscle memory. 30 minutes starting now. Let's go. Shoot. Okay. First was fellow student Frank Borman, greeting us all at the door like a politician with a close election coming up. Fresh from a teaching assignment, thermodynamics at the military academy and armed with a master's from Caltech, Frank was a tough competitor who flew well and who raced through the academic curriculum with slide rule practically smoking. Then there was Greg Newbeck, who had 3,000 hours in the T-33 jet trainer alone, half again as much flying time as I had altogether. Yet he was a couple of years younger. How had I managed to take so long to get so little done? No advanced degree, a piddling 2,000 hours flying time, 30 years old, and nothing special in my record to offset these deficiencies? There was a little time for feeling sorry for myself, though as Tom Stafford, the chief of the performance section, was determined to get us off on the right foot, doing the work of three himself, Old Mumble soon had us immersed in the intricacies of measuring the various performance parameters of new aircraft. The general pattern was, first, by classroom lectures, to learn the theoretical aspects of a particular type of test, then to make one or more flights trying out the new technique, and finally to analyze the reams of test data acquired during the flights. This last part, the reduction of thousands of bits of information, data points, into an intelligible report, complete with charts and graphs, was a tiresome, time-consuming process. It began in flight, when information was handwritten on a kneeboard, or instruments were photographed by a special camera, or an oscillograph traced on graph paper the record of 30 or more specific measurements. After each flight, the developed film and oscillograph paper were delivered to us, and weekends and nights would find us hunched over a desk calculator or peering at a film projector, trying to reduce this overwhelming amount of information into a terse report which would gain Stafford approval, so that we could move on to the next test series and begin the miserable process all over again. Ah, the glamour of the test pilot's life. As the months of schoolwork wore on, I was getting myopic and crotchety. Well, those are words. Thank you for that. Myopic and crotchety. But I knew that all was well down at the other end of the flight line where the real test pilots were. They, the chosen few assigned to test operations, were zooming through the skies in gleaming F-104 starfighters, while the student was chugging along in a T-28 powered by a washing machine engine. They were wearing silver pressure suits. My greasy flying suit was threadbare, especially in the seat. If I could only hang on a little longer, get incredible grades, write another half-dozen dazzling reports full of never-before-revealed tidbits of aeronautical lore, then perhaps I would too graduate, be sent to the test ops, fighter branch of course, and maybe even be given a clean flying suit. In the meantime, life was not 100% drudgery. We amused ourselves by swapping stories about our earlier flying ex-pilots, and Harley Johnson, our class character, would talk by the hour about his motorcycle racing career. We were all impressed, except Jack Tyson, who owned a 1918 Bentley, and who was impressed only by 1918 Bentley owners. We also had some memorable parties, usually on Friday night after a typical tedious week of academics, quizzes, a little flying, and a lot of data reduction. Then we would gather and drink and ignore our wives and discuss our future, after graduation, and complain about the few good jobs available and sometimes even sing ditties whose words don't seem worth repeating, but which generally describe the tribulations of poor pilots in a non-comprehending world. We also began to develop considerable confidence in our own abilities, and grudgingly had to admit that there was some merit to test the pilot school's approach, that the long hours were paying off. We learned to do things with airplanes which normally are not considered necessary or even possible. We learned to control the airspeed, for example, to the nearest knot. We learned to observe, remember, and record every last movement of a bucking, heavy, spinning plane. We learned to organize our tasks so that not 1 minute of precious flight test time was wasted. We set high standards and met them, and we were proud of it. We lived in a sloppy world, but we were precise, very precise. Our great fear was that we would not be able to use this precision, that we would be sent off somewhere to the bush leagues, that would be assigned to fly endless circles in the sky while an engineer in the back of the plane twiddled with the dials of some new electronic box. For every bona fide test pilot job in the Air Force, there are 10 which masquerade under the name. The majority of our class would fill these questist pilot positions, and we knew it, and we waited, and we worried, for the Air Force personnel system is not noted for its sensitivity or perspicacity. Finally, there's some good words in here. Perspicacity. Finally, the word arrived. Jim Erring, who a dozen years later would talk and ride on the moon as one of the Apollo 15 crew, was one of the disappointed ones. So was Harley Johnson, and so in fact were most of the class, Borman and Newbeck, were to stay on stay on as instructors in the school, an honor, but the only available slot in fighter ops went, by that alchemy I will never know, to Mike Collins. From that point on, it was all downhill. I can't recall our graduation speaker or what he said, a sad fact that I have ruminated on more than once when I have found myself sweltering in a borrowed gown on a rickety platform about to deliver a graduation harangue of my own. In truth, the only graduation speaker to make any lasting impression on me was Roscoe Turner, who in 1953 had come to the graduation of our primary pilot school class at Columbus, Mississippi, the most colorful racing pilot from the golden age of aviation between the world wars. Roscoe had us sitting goggle-eyed as he matter-of-factly described that wild world of aviation that we all knew was gone forever. Roscoe had flown with a wax mustache and a pet lion named Gilmore. We flew with a rule book, a slide rule, and a computer. To get to the moon would require a very big computer. A whole basement full of computers, in fact. But the spring of 1961 at Edwards, I was somewhere between Gilmore and Moon, in the realm of starfighters and super sabers and delta darts, sophisticated machines which bridged the gap between the colorful past I knew I had missed and complex future I did not know was coming. I was content. I was off to fighter ops. I even went shopping for a Model A Ford. Damn. He got himself a car. 2. Chapter 2. Plans, coordinates, and conducts flight test programs on experimental and production type aircraft to evaluate and report the flight characteristics, performance, stability, and functional utility as a military weapon system. Evaluates and reports the stability, serviceability, and functioning of installed components and equipment. Conducts test support flights as required in the accomplishment of military and contractor flight test programs. Represents the Air Force Flight Test Center as direct in conferences and meetings which concern the flight test missions. Duties of a test pilot from Air Force Regulations, 1962. In addition to the above, test pilots that have a touch of schizophrenia, they must think about a new airplane, not only in terms of how difficult it is for them to master, but how it will be for the average pilot who has not had their specialized training and experience. If something is not quite right, what should be done? On the one hand, perhaps nothing. On the other, maybe it had better go on back to the factory for expensive and time-consuming modifications. Perhaps a gentle warning to the customer might suffice. With each new plane comes a book, a thick book, the pilot's handbook, his Bible, and it is chock full of terse admonitions describing various sins of omission and commission. These are categorized as to their seriousness, and put in little boxes to make them more eye-watching. Warning, caution, note. Warning. Operating procedures, practices, etc., which will result in personal injury or loss of life if not carefully followed. Operating procedures, practices, etc., which if not strictly observed will result in damage to or destruction of equipment. An operating procedure, condition, etc., which it is considered essential to highlight. When to ignore, when to warn, when to fix. This is the most important judgment the test pilot must make. In general, he finds himself arguing the case for the pilot at the expense of the project manager's precious schedule. Harry, I don't care if we've gotten this far without an accident or not. I'm telling you, the canopy jettison handle sticks out too far, and someone is going to snag it with his flying suit sleeve if he gets in a hurry reaching for the Takan channel selector. Be careful. Hell yes, we're careful. That's why it hasn't happened so far. But how has some poor second lieutenant in bad weather at night for the first time when he's clanked up anyway? Caution. So what should it say? Beware the handle or don't get clunked up in a bad weather at night? Come on, Harry. Besides, we are getting so many cautions that the hand of book is getting to be the size of Bronx phone book. This one needs fixing. And so it goes. Not bad training for someone who might inadvertently jettison a canopy or hatch in lunar orbit. In fact, to me, the amazing, the incredible, the fantastic, pardon the slip into the astronaut parlance, fact is that so many few crew mistakes and mishaps have occurred during Gemini and Apollo flights. The opportunities for error are almost limitless, and only superlative design permits virtually error-free operations of a machine as complex as an Apollo command module. As will be discussed later, the astronauts were hired early enough to participate in the design phases of Gemini and Apollo, and in my view, this was one of the wisest decisions NASA made. A test pilot, more than any other type of aviator, must be objective. It is all right for a squadron pilot to fall in love with his airplane. It is all he has to fly, and he might just as well enjoy it because it has already been designed. It exists in its present form, and no one is going to change it now. He can afford to put on his blinders, compile a long list of prejudices in his favor, and develop an almost religious fever when discussing it. He can look with no scorn or pity on the unwashed from the neighboring squadron who are not so privileged. The test pilot cannot fall into this trap. Just because he has spent years flying Convair products doesn't mean that Lockheed's system is not just as good. He must learn that the Convair's delicate feel is great for an all-weather interceptor at high altitude, but that Lockheed's heavier Styx forces are much more practical when working close to the ground. He must carefully analyze the possible uses to which a new airplane might be put and judge it accordingly. Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, for instance, had a longitudinal instability which generally would have been considered objectable. However, Lindbergh didn't mind because the constant attention he had to pay to the elevator control helped to keep him awake during the long, lonely hours over the Atlantic. As in almost other professions, a test pilot does not instantaneously find himself at the top of the heap. Rather, there is an apparatus journeyman system, at least there was at Edwards, to guide and advise and develop the neophyte, the new boy, at fighter test. For instance, finds he had inherited the most undesirable jobs, paramount among which is that called the barrier. The barrier is a device for slowing down airplanes in a hurry, hopefully without damaging them. It is a last-ditch affair, designed to grab a speeding jet at the very end of the runway and prevent its crashing into trees and houses or whatever lies beyond. The barrier usually consists of a single heavy cable stretched across the runway, which snags the airplane by popping up in front of its main landing gear, or by grabbing a tail hook, which the pilot lowers when he sees that he is overshooting the runway. Once the speeding jet is securely attached to the cable, the jet's tremendous kinetic energy must somehow be absorbed within a few seconds in order to bring the beast to a super quick stop. Various energy-absorbing schemes have been used, such as dragging heavy chains across the ground, towing a scoop through a closed conduit filled with water, or using hydraulically actuated aircraft brakes. Each new system must be tested and verified for a wide variety of weights, speeds, and aircraft types. All this is done at Edwards. And when the telephone rings in fighter ops, the old heads have the uncanny ability to know when it is the barrier test engineers calling for a pilot. Disappearing into the woodwork, mumbling excuses about writing test reports, they vanish, leaving the shiny new boy to be offered up to a sacrifice to the ferocious maw of the barrier god. Arriving at the appointed spot, a deserted runway ending at the lake's bed's edge, the new test pilot is quickly strapped into the oldest, most dilapidated jet he has ever seen, a model long since abandoned by even the South American air forces. Peering down through cobwebs and bird's nest, he is shown the one and only shiny new gauge in the cockpit, the airspeed indicator, all important in delivering a precise reading of the amount of kinetic energy, 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared, the engineer demands for a given test run. The engineer has consulted his slide rule, charts, computer, and astrologer, and screams up to the cockpit over the whine of the engine, which the sweating pilot has finally managed to start, with laconic advice from a disgusted mechanic who obviously feels personally insulted by having been sent this imbecile. Say, is it Collins? Okay, Collins, we need 82 knots on this one. No faster, please, Collins. They need the name to be put on the accident form. Lining up at a respectful distance from the barrier, Collins examines the adversary as a noviciero might scrutinize his first fat Pamplona bull. Only in this case, he is the bull. He must do the charging. He must steer this juggernaut towards the artful dodger at the end of the runway. He feels eyes on him, but there is no applause from the crowd. As he revs up the tired engine, releases brakes, and steers towards the center of the barrier, 82 knots he'll show them. 70, 75, oops, 85, oops, 90. Slow her down. 82 on the button. Damn. 87, thump. Out of the corner of his eye, he notices that the thump was the barrier cable passing under the airplane's wheels. He jerks the throttle to idle and braces himself for the jolting deceleration to follow. Nothing happens. By this time, the end of the runway has come and gone, and he is trailing a large cloud of dust as he zips out into the lake bed. Finally slows down enough to turn around and heads back. Someone mistaking the dust for smoke has called the fire department, and an escort of bright red trucks with flashing red lights follows him back to his parking spot, where a welcome committee is gathered. The mechanic examines his battered old machine with studied amazement as if he has never seen one like it before. The test engineer is mesmerized by his own calculations. 82 knots, Collins. Did you have 82 when you passed over the cable? Collins admits to an extra 5. The heinous number is recorded for posterity when much grumbling and clucking, and the engineer departs in a pickup truck. The fire department leaves in Messe. Coffee break, and the pilot dejectedly finds his way back to operations. His boss barely looks up from the Arcery board. Forgot to drop the tail hook, Collins. Test is rescheduled for the morning. Collins never forgot the tail hook again. Like the biblical 7 lean years and 7 fat years, the pendulum of Edwards seems to swing back and forth. There are never the right number of test pilots or test programs, but always too many or too few. The Air Force should be able to keep a stable of prototype aircraft flying, winnowing and pruning, and finally selecting only the best for production. But given the McNamara's of this world, the system is not allowed to work that way. McNamara decreed that the F-111 would be a great success long before the test program began. In fact, he decreed that it would be every plane for every purpose, sort of like building a car to drive daddy to work, or to handle mom's groceries, or to mix concrete on weekends, except in May, when it would be easy practicing for the Indianapolis 500. Fortunately, the Navy had the smarts and the guts to decline Nicama's kind offer, even if he was the boss. But in 1961, the Air Force Flight Test Center was gearing up for the great F-111. Early programs were finishing up and closing down, and work was hard to find. The 7 lean years later were beginning. Also, for the first time, Edwards had a competitor, NASA. With its burgeoning space budget and far-out plans for landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, on top of that, the rumor was out that they were hiring astronauts again. They had, of course, already picked 7 in 1959, the original 7, who were all military test pilots. These men, who had also been exposed to greater public scrutiny than any group of pilots, engineers, scientists, freaks, or what have you in recorded history, and the reaction had been uniformly good. All of them came through as Gordon good guy, steely resolve mixed with robust muscular good humor, waiting crinkly-eyed for whatever ghastly hazards might be in store for them up there. There was no disturbance psychs in the bunch either, for the wide publicity included lurid accounts of their sessions and psychiatrists. Their ability to stand icy dark desolation or searing heat in a big oven. There had also been extensive scrutiny and moral checks, background investigations as they are called, which had gotten all skeletons out of their closets, although I recall L. Shepard's lopsided, malevolent grin a few years later. I still have a few secrets. They were la creme, and the nation loved them. Except for the old heads at Edwards. Some were disgruntled because they had not been selected, too old, too tall, no degree, or simply rejected. But others have actively avoided the selection like the plague. In retrospect, I can't say whether their reasons were obtuse or perceptive, but they do seem to me to be a fascinating indication of the time and place. Man, they were here to fly, not to be locked up in a can and shot around the world like ammunition. They were master craftsmen, artists. They were Jonathan Livingston Seagulls. They flew in smooth control and command. They flew day after day in various machines to prove various things, but they flew. In Project Mercury, on the other hand, one road, granted there had always been one Mercury flight so far. A.I. Shepard's 15-minute up and downer, but he was a passenger man, a talking monkey. At Edwards, the old heads clucked with disapproval. Why all the fuss? Not 1/4 of the skill, finesse, or flying technique of an X-15 flight was required here. Yet the public went wild. Life magazine showered them with the money to tell their personal stories to the eager nation. But had X-15 pilot Bob White had been offered a similar deal, the Air Force would have summarily turned it down. Besides, who are all these people anyway? Slatton was the only one who has ever been assigned to fighter ops. Cooper had been in engineering, for God's sake. And old Deck must have taken leave for his senses to forsake a fighter test assignment to get shot off somewhere in a tin can, not having accumulated sufficient credentials to be so snotty. The new boys watched and wondered. I certainly had no childhood dream of flying to the moon or anywhere else, but the idea was damned appealing. It had also been endorsed by the president, and it beat the barrier 4 ways to Sunday. For me, on May 25th, 1961, President Kennedy, in a special message to Congress on urgent national needs, had included this oft quote, yet still stirring message. I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single project in this period will be more impressive to mankind, or more important for the long range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. Clincher came on February 20th, 1962, with the John Glenn's magnificent 3-orbit flight aboard Friendship 7. Imagine being able to circle the globe once each 90 minutes, high above all clouds and turbulence. Kennedy's moon loomed a bit closer now. And the old heads at Edwards no longer seemed to be above all competition. So despite the fact that I was picking up some interesting piecework, flying odd jobs in the F-100 and F-102 and F-104 jet fighters, I was more than ready when, April 1962, NASA announced that it would select a new group of astronauts to supplement the Immortal 7. NASA's terse announcement was encouraging in that the agency was sticking with test pilots. This narrowed the field considerably, as there just weren't that many certified test pilots around. Even though NASA was opening the selection to civilian as well as military pilots, a degree in one of the biological sciences or engineering was required, and candidates could not be more than 6 feet tall or over 35 years old. As one of the day of selection, 5 to 10 were to be picked, with June the 1st the cutoff date for applications. My application was in before the ink was dry on the announcement. The Air Force decided not to pass all applications on to NASA, but to conduct some preliminary screening of its own. At the end of May, I was summoned to Washington for an interview by the Air Force personnel specialists, and those of us who passed that were called back to Washington in the later part of June for a couple of days of indoctrination in how to make a favorable impression on NASA during their forthcoming tests and interviews. We promptly dubbed this Charm School, and weren't quite sure whether to be offended, to scoff at its validity, or to take its lessons to heart. Perhaps the Air Force had been pleased that, of the original 7, only 3 were Air Force officers. At any rate, we would be radio announcers. We read selected passages aloud, and these were critiqued to great length by a man who held a PhD in education. We made impromptu speeches. We were told how to talk, dress, stand, and sit, wearing knee-length socks, so no gross expanse of hairy leg intruded upon whatever PhDs in education think about. How to answer long drink and make it last. We even got pep talks from General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, and General Bernard Schriever, Research and Development Commander, who were almost as good as Roscoe Turner. But, in my opinion, the apogee of the course was surely reached the day we learned how to hold our hands on our hips. Doesn't anyone learn anything at home anymore? Thumbs forward, ladies. Thumbs to the rear, gentlemen. To reverse would not only be, perhaps even worse, but, of course, would result in an instant detection and rejection by NASA. The old meanies. I have studied this matter exhaustively in later years, and have found burly construction workers with thumbs forward and mincing fairies with thumbs aft. But then they obviously are not charmed school grads. Armed with the kind of self-confidence with this information genders, I was ready for the next hurdle, which was a real one, passing a 5-day physical exam conducted by the Air Force. Looks like that's 30 minutes. That was 30 minutes of reading every day for the rest of my life. Yeah. yeah, that was day 83. I am at the middle of page 27. See y'all day 84. Let's go.